action research presentation. Oh, I'll start now. All right, so welcome to our presentation. Our topic is focused on student-centered learning in education. So, our group, we have John, Anthony, Jordan, and myself, and we each chose our 4 subtopics. So that is using technology to implement student-centered learning in English and literacy development, how does student choice influence levels of participation in physical education practical lessons, and how intrinsic and extrinsic motivation affects students' school performance. So our research focus was mainly to identify how student-centered learning can be better implemented in classrooms. Within the educational field, there has also been a large degree of debate and research into whether explicit instruction or student-centered learning has better effects on student learning, and we wanted to look into this for our topic. So our overarching question, how can student-centered learning be effectively implemented in the classroom to improve student engagement and learning outcomes? We chose this topic because current teaching practices increasingly emphasize learner agency, active participation, and personalized learning. Many students thrive when they are given choices, opportunities for self-direction, and learning experiences that connect with their interests and strengths. Understanding how to implement student-centered learning and whether it genuinely improves classroom engagement allows teachers to refine their instructional strategies. This research also responds to the need for classrooms that support independence, critical thinking, and motivation across subjects, whether in practical physical education lessons or academically demanding areas like English.
Okay, so looking at the intervention. So to address the perceived issue of declining student agency and motivation in matters concerning their own learning, we have sought to explore the pedagogy of student-centered learning in practice in classrooms in Western Sydney. Among the contributing factors to student-centered learning, we have sought to focus on investigating the use of technology, as well as student-centered learning's impact on participation during PDHP practical lessons, its application in English classrooms and literacy development, and also how intrinsic and extrinsic motivation enables student-centered learning, with the aim of identifying and evaluating how student-centered learning can serve to reconcile students with learning to obtain syllabus outcomes and promote post-school success. So what our intervention actually is, as we've called it, the skill to self model. So it focuses on moving the skill from the teacher's guidance to self. So that's student choice and ownership. So this model or intervention aims to blend a hybrid model of explicit instruction, flipped learning, and student-centered learning into one effective teaching and learning model based on our group's findings through our literature reviews and data collection. So what does it look like? So first of all, we'll start with some pre-learning. So this is your flipped learning or your explicit instruction. So students through video or technology will engage in a short instructional video before class, and then that way they'll gain that knowledge and prepare for in-class learning. Second to that will be scaffolded guidance. So they'll be given clear structured supports like checklists or steps that are provided to help students successfully practice the skill or complete the task. Thirdly, student choice and personalization. So this is where the student-centered learning comes into play. Students will be given options regarding the activity or approach which encouragement engagement, ownership, and differentiated application of the skill or knowledge. Fourth, the implementation in class. All right. So students practice the concept or skill using the provided scaffolds while the teacher observes, offers feedback, and makes necessary adjustments. And finally, reflection and feedback. So gathering quick student input on the activity's effectiveness and challenges allows for data-driven adjustments to future lessons. So an example of this model in action, and we're using the example of PDHP as a KLA. So the pre-learning, that could be a video on how to throw a ball correctly. The scaffold, so that could be instruction cards showing grip, stance, and follow through steps when throwing a ball. The student choice will come into play when during class time, they'll choose which sport to practice throwing a ball. So it could be basketball or netball, and in what order they complete those activities. The implementation, so practice in class with guidance from the teacher and peer support. And finally, the reflection. Students provide feedback on which sport and activity help them learn the best.
So for the phases of our action research cycle, This intervention has been integrated into the four phases of the action research cycle. So, planning. As a group, we collectively came up with a topic which has an impact on student education and subtopics which we each felt strongly about. In the acting and researching phase, we individually researched our subtopics to familiarize ourselves with what the contemporary research has to say. In the observation phase, we observed on our placements. We each used our data collection protocols to gather, collate, and review our findings through various means. And finally, we reflected, which means after coding our collected data, we synthesized our findings in order to present whether the intervention has been successful or not. So across the fields of educational technology, English pedagogy, and physical education, a consistent narrative emerges. Student-centered learning is increasingly positioned as a critical driver of engagement, motivation, and meaningful learning. Although each discipline conceptualizes and enacts student-centered learning differently, through technology-enabled personalization, negotiated meaning making, or autonomy supportive choice, common mechanisms underpin their effectiveness. Together, these three reviews demonstrate that autonomy, relevance, competence, collaboration, and teacher beliefs act as central enablers of student-centered learning, while persistent structural and attitudinal barriers continue to inhibit its implementation. So, some common themes that we found from our literature reviews were a shift towards autonomy and agency. So, all four literature reviews emphasized a broad educational shift from teacher-centered practices to approaches that prioritize student agency. In technology-enhanced student-centered learning, autonomy manifests through personalized learning, adaptive technologies, and the flipped classroom, enabling students to control pacing, pathways, and engagement. In English classrooms, autonomy appears as self-direction, where students take ownership of writing, interpretation, and collaboration. Studies such as Anson show that when students' spontaneous or oppositional contributions are valued, their agency becomes a source of deeper engagement. In physical education, autonomy is conceptualized through student choice, a construct closely tied to self-determination theory. Offering choice in activities, pacing, or roles increases autonomous motivation and participation. And across all the disciplines, student-centered practices enhance motivation, engagement, and enjoyment, which suggests that autonomy is not only pedagogically desirable, but also psychologically essential. So, collaboration as a core mechanism of student-centered learning. This is the second theme that's come up from our literature reviews. So, in technology-enhanced student-centered learning, it often depends on collaborative digital tools, such as interactive in-class activities, peer-driven learning, which is supported by flipped instruction. English research highlights collaboration as particularly powerful, where peer feedback and shared problem-solving strengthen language acquisition. And for cross-age tutoring, it further demonstrates how structured peer learning can improve confidence and proficiency. In PE, structured autonomy such as role rotation or peer coaching serves both social and motivational functions, building relatedness as well as competence. So these three reviews together suggest that collaboration is not a supplemental feature of student-centered learning, but it is also central to its effectiveness and must be intentionally structured rather than assumed. So next is personalization and differentiation. So while personalization is most explicitly discussed in the technology review, it's still evident throughout the other ones. So personalized learning technologies allow students to engage their own levels of ability. In English, self-directed writing and negotiating readings function as personalized literacy experiences where students' backgrounds and identities shape the learning process. And in PE, choice menus and differentiated tasks allow students to engage at appropriate levels of challenge, supporting perceived competence. Across the disciplines, student-centered learning works best when it provides tailored pathways, not one-size-fits-all experiences. So also we have the importance of teacher beliefs and professional learning. So all the reviews identify teacher beliefs, confidence, and training as central barriers or conversely enablers. So technology-enabled student-centered learning is strongly influenced by first and second order barriers. So teachers who doubt the value of technology or lack the self-efficacy to implement it end up implementing it poorly or not at all. English teachers must recognize the values of student voices, including oppositional ones, to enact authentic self-direction, which requires a philosophical shift in how teachers interpret classroom behaviors. As well as this, PE teachers often express willingness to implement choice, but require professional learning and structural supports to manage class complexity. Therefore, teacher mindsets, more than the resources they have, determine the success of student-centered learning implementation. Professional learning is also important as it must focus not only on new practices, but also on reshaping underlying beliefs about student capability, autonomy, and classroom structure. So equity considerations, the reviews also point towards important equity implications. In technology supported student-centered learning, it can increase access for students in low resource environments. In English, it highlights the need to honor diverse linguistic and cultural backgrounds. For PE studies, note gaps concerning how choice structures support students with disabilities or low confidence. And across all disciplines, student-centered learning has potential to reduce inequities. Next.
So, the way we gathered our research came down to our primary method of collecting information, which relied on collecting qualitative data through interviews and surveys. While the specific question asked in each of our interviews and surveys are unique to the topics we covered, all data collected to be presented today has been de-identified and has been reproduced with informed consent from all participants. The main goal of our interview and surveys was to assess the current usage and viability of student-centered learning in classrooms across Western Sydney. Thusly, most of our questions prioritize asking in-service teachers their thoughts on student-centered learning and what they believe to be the implications of applying the pedagogy in classes like theirs. Synthesizing all the data we have, or we got from all our surveys and interviews, some of the data yields three primary categories of data and the three associated subcategories. Student motivation to participate in activity being the first, with the following subcategories of purpose, engagement, and confidence. The second being the necessity for explicit instruction to prepare students for student-centered learning. And the third being the barriers, which form from a range of factors that inhibit student participation in student-centered learning, with the associated subcategories of disruptive elements, accessibility, and preparation. Some additional codes that we found as well that didn't quite fit into these primary categories included peer learning opportunities from student-centered learning and the encouragement of self-explanation. As you can see in the table at the bottom, you have motivation, explicit instruction, and motivation associated confidence being all actors that are factors identified in all our surveys and interviews, with motivation related purpose and motivation related engagement being somewhat common in only 2 data sets, and barriers for participation being identified in the other 2. How this informs our practice comes down to recognizing the value of explicit instruction in preparing students to engage in student-centered learning and providing that safe environment via scaffolding. Our intervention aims to provide that specific space for students to engage in learning prior to the lesson by providing students with the advantage of being prepared through a well-structured environment. We are able to tackle most of the issues regarding motivation identified in our data. Providing additional space and time for students to demonstrate acquisition of skills, we also facilitate peer learning and the development of self-explanation abilities. With that being said, however, work will still need to be done in reconciling students with limited access to equipment necessary for participation, per the issue of differentiation. Fortunately, with this whole talk about motivation, one of our researchers did focus entirely on that motivation, and through their research, they identified 5 key factors, 5 key themes related to motivation. The first being engagement through autonomy, which identified keywords of freedom of choice, open-ended tasks, and personally relevant topics. Intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, which are linked to increased likelihoods of passion, which typically leads to students, trying a little bit more harder in things that they are obviously intrinsically motivated to do. Whereas intrinsic motivation is linked to accountability and discipline, so being held accountable and being forced to do something typically leads to students to do something usually more consistent. Student differences is the next category we have found. With developing students require structured support with student-centered learning. Typically, it is targeted towards more high-achieving and more capable students. Thus, the students that don't meet that threshold to participate are often left behind and usually exacerbate issues of confidence and organizational skills. So if they don't have that, typically they will get worse in that regard if we do not provide the support. The fourth category you identified was the variable outcomes with autonomy. With a SCL has a high likelihood of overwhelming learners, which can lead to adverse effects to motivation and disengagement. And the fifth one being structuring and scaffolding. Scaffolding and structure is very necessary in terms of differentiation.
All right, how do we ensure continuous improvement from the student-centered learning intervention? So to ensure continuous improvement from this intervention, participation and engagement data will be collected regularly through observations, quick student feedback, and simple tracking tools. So both summative and formative forms of assessing student learning and engagement. Lessons will be frequently reviewed and adjusted based on what activities increase or reduce engagement. Students will guide ongoing refinements, ensuring activities remain relevant, inclusive, and motivating. And a balanced mix of student choice and teacher-led structure will also be evaluated and adapted over time to sustain student participation. Collaboration with colleagues and periodic reflection on progress against clear goals will also support consistent evidence-based improvements. Thank you.